Hey everyone, today I'm back to read the next few chapters of Not a Drop to Drink. So we left off on chapter 9 last time. So the girl slept through the morning and Lynn took the opportunity to confirm the fact that she did have lice and fleas. She heaved a long sigh as she rocked back on her heels, contemplating the work to be done. The girl could bathe in water straight from the pond. It would have to be warmed on the cook stove, then carried upstairs to the bathroom. She took one of Mother's huge canning pots down from a hook in the ceiling. It would take a very hot fire and a lot of time to boil the amount of water necessary for cleaning the bedding. She made her first trip to the pond as a ribbon of pink was appearing on the horizon. A pistol was tucked into her belt, but Lynn was satisfied that nothing and no one was roaming in the grass. The onset of fall and the lack of rain had dried everything to a crisp, making any movement a crackling announcement of your presence. The sight of the pond's gravelly bank didn't improve her mood. A fresh, new ribbon of shiny broken mussel shells and small rocks showed where the pond had recently receded. The white grip of her bucket handle loomed ever closer to the surface. Lynn toyed with the idea of leaning in to grab it, removing forever the implied threat at the sight of it. But without it, she was lost. All ponds have a bottom. She could only hope that hers was still well beneath the surface. If Mother had known exactly how deep the pond was, she'd never told Lynn. The bucket handle was the only frame of reference she had. Her boot stuck in the fresh mire near the pond's edge as she struggled up the bank. It came free with a sucking sound and sent her reeling forward, dumping half a bucket of freezing water down on her leg. Son of a bitch, she screamed the worst thing she'd ever heard Mother say, then kicked the bucket in anger, which only resulted in splashing her with more cold water. Miserable and wet, she filled 2 more buckets and struggled toward the house with them. The basement air was warm and welcoming after the biting cold of the fall morning. Lynn peeled her wet clothes off and hung them from the rafters, put on fresh clothes, and filled the stove pot with cold water. More wood went into the stove, and she checked her indoor supply. Low, nearly out. She'd have to haul more before the end of the day if she was going to get the girl clean, her sheets sanitized, and a large enough fire to keep them warm through the night. She considered waking the girl up and making her help, but the tiny little wrist hanging over the edge of her cot stopped her. It wasn't much thicker than the kindling she used to start fires. If she asked her to haul wood, it might snap. Once she started throwing wood in through the window, it would wake her. Lynn decided to give her a few more moments' rest. It was cold enough for her to slide mittens on to shield her fingers from the frigid metal of the antenna as she climbed onto the roof. There was nothing to the south. Lynn rested her binoculars on her chest. She hadn't heard gunshots lately. The men weren't hunting, though 3 weeks ago they'd been desperate enough to steal a few cans of food from a young girl and a pregnant woman. There was nothing from the streamers' camp. They were the streamers again, nicely impersonal. Lynn chose not to think of them as Eli and Neva, especially with no smoke rising after such a cold night. She raised the binoculars again and searched for Stebbs, not finding him. If he was off gathering water at his mysterious source, she might be able to spot him on his return trip. Half an hour passed with no movement. Disappointed, she laid the binoculars on the shingles beside her. 20 minutes later, a thread of worry had traced its way through her heart. Was he injured? Had she been too forceful with him last night when she threw him off balance? Had he hurt his leg? A flash of red caught her attention, and she flipped the binoculars back up. Stebbs emerged from inside, yawning and stretching. He patted his midsection a few times before sitting down on a large stump near his door. Lynn checked the sun. It was nearly 10 in the morning. Lazy asshole, she muttered. A rustling sound and the flight of several disturbed grasshoppers caught her attention, and Lynn dropped the binoculars, snapping the rifle up to her shoulder. Below, Lucy burst out of a clump of grass, empty palms desperately smacking at the grasshoppers. A lump formed in Lynn's throat. Hey, she yelled toward the ground. You don't have to do that anymore. Lynn looked around, trying to find her. Lucy looked around, trying to find her. Up here, Lynn called. I'm on the roof. The little girl shaded her eyes and waved when she saw Lynn. I don't have to do what? Eat grasshoppers, Lynn explained as she climbed down the antenna. I've got real food here. The girl made a face. I wasn't going to eat them. Who eats grasshoppers? Nobody, I guess, Lynn fumbled, forgetting that the boy had never fessed up to Lucy about what he was feeding her. I was catching them for you, Lucy continued. Eli was always saying that they made Mama happy, so I should catch as many as I could. I thought maybe they'd make you happy too. It would make me happy if you didn't come busting out of the grass like that, Lynn said. Don't surprise me when I've got a gun. I don't want to. She broke off, unable to speak around the lump that had gotten bigger. You don't want to what? I don't want to shoot you by accident. It began to rain, a lovely blessing for many reasons. Years ago, Mother had the insight to run a drain pipe from the roof down to the bathroom. The jagged edge of the rusty pipe was jammed with a piece of flannel that Lynn had jerked free. A tide of rusted water and leaf debris came first, spilling into the bucket she'd brought. Once the rainwater ran clear, she let it fall down to the tub to supplement the hot water she dragged up from the basement. What's that? Lucy's nose crinkled at the smell of the rotted leaves in the bucket. Just rotting stuff, Lynn said, swirling her hand through the water to test the temperature. This'll even out in a second, and I'll plug the pipe so it's not dripping rainwater on your head. The girl shrugged her indifference and continued to pick at a scab on her knee. Why don't you turn on the faucet? Lynn sighed and rested her head on the side of the tub. I told you, I don't have running water. That's why I was dragging buckets up from the basement. The mundane task of boiling water had brought quizzical Lucy to the edge of the stove, climbing onto a chair to pinpoint the exact moment the bubbles started forming on the surface. How do I know when it's boiling? The question had brought Lynn to an abrupt halt. I don't know, 'cause it's boiling. The answer hadn't satisfied Lucy, so Lynn explained the concept of bubbles and steam. Haven't you ever boiled water? No, Lucy said defensively. Why would I? That response, combined with the request to turn on the faucets, caused Lynn's own curiosity to flutter. Where are you from, anyway? What were you doing out in the woods? In Targo, the girl answered, testing the water with her fingertips. Lynn stopped stirring the water. In Targo, she repeated. The big city? Yeah, Lucy said, blissfully unaware of the effect her answer had. We've lived there my whole life, till we had to leave. Why? What happened? Don't know. We just did. Lynn hadn't known many people in her life, but the flat line of the girl's mouth was familiar enough to her. There would be no more conversation along that line. Lynn stuffed the flannel rag back into the end of the drain pipe, ignoring the spray that spattered her as she fought against the flow. She dug into the linen cupboard for a thin washcloth and a bar of flat white soap, handing them to the girl. Lynn looked at the bar in her hand. What's this for? It's soap, to wash with. The girl looked dubiously at the bar, then sniffed it. It doesn't smell like the soap from home. It smells like clean, Lynn said briskly. Mother and I made that ourselves. That's hard work, so don't you be wasting it. Lucy closed her grip around the soap. Where's your mama? Dead. The little girl nodded and stopped asking questions. Young as she was, she understood that the conversation ended there. Lynn cleared her throat. All right then, you clean up good. Wash your hair with this. She handed Lucy a bottle filled with a green gel. Let it sit for a bit before you rinse off. The little girl bit down an objection when she saw the picture of a dog on the bottle, but took it meekly enough. Toss your clothes out in the hall, Lynn continued. I'll be burning them. There was no response, so she slid out the door. Wait! The anxious call brought her back. What is it? I can't do these, the girl said, pointing to her shoelaces. Lynn sighed and plopped down onto the floor next to the girl. It's not so hard, she said. You just pull on the loose end. Didn't your mama teach you that? I can untie my shoe, Lucy said haughtily. They just won't come off. Without asking for an explanation, Lynn tugged on the laces. The rotten ends fell off in her hands. Sit still, she ordered, and went to the kitchen for a knife. The rest of the laces split easily under the blade. She gripped the shoe and was about to tug it off when the girl cried out, digging her fingernails into the bar of soap. What's the problem? The girl only shook her head, biting down on her lip as Lynn slid the sneaker off her tiny foot. The bloody, pus-encrusted sock answered her question. Kid, she said, covering her nose against the smell, how long have you been out there? The attic brought back memories that Lynn would have preferred to leave buried. It wasn't a place they'd used often, only when putting away the clothes Lynn had outgrown and finding the box that held her next size. Mother had always called it going shopping, and encouraged Lynn to try on everything as soon as she found the right box. It had been a game of sorts, one of the few times Mother would rest, reclining on an old chair propped in the corner as Lynn tossed clothes everywhere in her excitement. Clothes. Clothes and shoes. Lynn was guessing as she made her way through the antique. Wait, sorry. There it is. Okay. Lynn was guessing as she made her way through the antique trunks Mother had used for storage. Lucy couldn't be nearly the size she'd been when she was 5. It might be best to go for a size lower. She popped the lid on the right trunk, glancing through the contents for something for the girl to put on when she was out of the tub. Something warm, Lynn muttered to herself as she tossed aside clothes. The rain continued to fall, pounding out a staccato beat on the roof of the attic. What little light there was came from a small circular window. A pair of shoes rolled out of the pile of clothes she was holding and rattled to the floor. She considered them briefly, but tossed them aside. Lucy's feet had practically become a part of her shoes. The sides had burst long ago, and water had seeped into them. Judging by the state of her feet, the little girl hadn't complained, so no one had told her to take her socks off and dry them. She made a pile of warm clothes, choosing only 2 or 3 outfits. Lucy wasn't moving in, she reminded herself firmly. She was only staying until when? The look the boy had shot her yesterday had said that Lucy's mother wasn't going to make it. Once he was free, would the boy move on or stay to care for the little girl? Lynn hadn't thought past the initial action of taking Lucy with her, when Eli's gray eyes had begged her to. Suddenly angry with herself, Lynn snagged 2 pairs of warm socks out of the trunk and slammed the lid shut. A high-pitched singing filled the downstairs, along with splashing noises. Lynn paused before opening the door. The unencumbered sound of happiness was so odd to her that she allowed Lucy's off-pitched, unfamiliar tune to fill her ears, like the rising sound of the filling water tanks. A massive splash in wasted water cresting over the edge of the tub made her crack the door to the bathroom. Hey in there, you need to be getting out soon. Water will get cold, and I don't need you sick on top of everything. I gotta see to your feet as it is. There was a long pause. Will it hurt? Probably, Lynn answered, thinking of the flaps of skin that had peeled off along with the socks. I think I'll stay in a little bit more. Come on now, Lynn said, pushing her way into the bathroom. You've been in there long enough. Lucy's frail body floated on the surface of the tepid water. Her ribs stuck out so far that water had rushed into the valleys in between them. More dead skin had slid off her feet in the water. Strips of it trailed from her heel. Lynn wrapped her in a towel, astonished at the lack of weight in her arms. The girl burrowed into her cotton fortress and admired her new outfits while Lynn picked through the hair for dead lice and nits. There had been a thriving civilization on Lucy's head, and it took the better part of the afternoon to rid her of them. Lynn saved the feet for last, once Lucy was happily snuggled into her basement cot and eating corn. The warm bath combined with food and the heat from the fire lulled her. Lynn waited until she had fallen asleep, her small hands still tightly gripping the spoon. Her feet were a mess. Dead skin hung in flaps from blisters long since burst. A fungal infection covered most of her left sole, and all her toenails had grown inward in response to the shoes that hadn't left her feet. It was a miracle that the girl could still walk. The dead skin came off first. Lucy's feet twitched in response, but there was no real pain. The baking soda paste Lynn had used on the fungus caused her to whimper a little, but she soon quieted. The toenails presented a real problem. Cutting them out was going to be painful. 3 of her toes were inflamed with the pressure. 2 of them had pus-filled cysts under the skin. It would have to wait until Stubbs was there to hold her down. There was a small supply of painkillers hidden away with the guns, but Lynn could never remember using them. When she was about Lucy's age, one of her eardrums had burst from an infection. It had swollen so tightly that the eventual rupture had spewed pus, blood, and small pieces of her eardrum. She'd held her tongue tightly against the pain, knowing that Mother had been splinting her own broken ankle a week before without so much as a Tylenol. Lynn's hand snuck to her ear as she remembered. Mother had been furious with her, even as she'd sponged the stinking mess of pus from her face. You should have told me, she'd seethed. I would have given you something. But Lynn was partly deaf at that time, and Mother's words had been muffled. They were both saving the pain medications for another day, a different, more horrible wound. The fever had passed, her eardrum had grown back, and the painkillers remained untouched. Lynn pressed one of Lucy's infected toes experimentally, and the girl whimpered in her sleep. Lucy had done the same, hidden her pain to save others the worry. Lynn pulled the covers down over the small white feet, tucking them under her heels. When it's time, we'll use the medicine, little one, she said softly. You don't need to suffer more than you have. Okay. Chapter 10. Stebbs appeared a few hours later, at dusk. The reverberations of his awkward footfall on the basement steps caused Lucy to stir but not wake. Lynn lifted the edge of the sheet that hung drying from the rafters. Shh, she admonished, gesturing toward the small form humped underneath the blankets. Don't wake her. Sorry, Stebbs whispered, then gestured for her to follow him. Lynn grabbed her rifle and tucked a pistol into her belt. Above ground, the sun was leaving the last hint of a pink stripe in the sky. Stebbs considered it while talking to Lynn. You think she'll sleep long? Don't know. Not around kids much. He grunted in response. She fell asleep right after her bath. Lynn added, I don't imagine we'll be long down at the stream anyway. The implied question wasn't answered, and she glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. Sorry about last night, she finally muttered. I shouldn't have pushed you. I shouldn't have pushed you either, he said. It was her turn to grunt. They both watched the horizon for a few minutes, their gazes drawn to the south. All right then. She hoisted her rifle across her shoulder. Let's go and be done with it. They made their way to the creek, conscious of the rustling of nocturnal wildlife all around them. A raccoon lumbered across their path. He stood on his hind feet and studied them closely, his black nose wiggling while he tried to place their scent. Scat, Stebbs hissed at him. The coon lowered himself and tumbled into the night, unconcerned by their presence. Used to be we shot them that acted like that, Stebbs said. Meant they were sick with the distemper. And he's not? Stebbs shook his head. Doubt it. Just don't know what to think of people, was all. We're not as common as we used to be. They trudged on for a few more minutes in silence. Almost there, Lynn said when she spotted her own boot prints in the wet bank. They stood out black and yellow even in the dying light of dusk. This is where I spotted the girl. You should be the one to call to him, Stebbs said, being as he'll know your voice. We didn't talk all that much, Lynn said, then cupped her hands over her mouth. Hello. The only answer was the rustling of fallen beech leaves and a frantic scurrying sound in the underbrush nearby. Try again, said Stebbs. She shouted again, this time adding a high-pitched whistle at the end of her call. No response. How bad of a shape were they in? Stebbs asked. Lynn's eyebrows drew together in concern. Not as bad as all that, she said, unless someone... A piercing scream split the night air, dropping Stebbs and Lynn to the ground in an instant, their hands going to their pistols at their belts. It broke on a high note, followed by a screech and a howl of pain that dwindled into a racking sob. The woman, Stebbs said soberly, that would be labor. Labor? The baby's being born. Lynn's hand tightened on her gun, for all the good that would do for her in this situation. What do we do? Stebbs got to his feet awkwardly and brushed the dead leaves from his flannel shirt. I know a thing or two about it, he said. If that boy is as green as you say, I doubt he's much help. Lynn stayed on the ground, peering through the bracken as if for an enemy. What do you want me to do? Get up, for one. He hauled her to her feet. Lynn went to the camp when they were close enough to make out the feeble gray wisps of smoke climbing skyward from the fire. Eli burst out of the shelter, looking wildly in every direction. Girl, is that you? He held a branch above his head in case it wasn't her, but he didn't look like he posed much of a threat. His weapon was thicker than his arm. Christ, he's skinny, Stebbs muttered. I'm coming in with a friend, Lynn yelled toward the camp, pausing only slightly before the word friend used to describe Stebbs. They splashed across the stream to Eli, who lowered his club and squinted into the night. Hello, son, Stebbs said as he emerged from the darkness. Name's Stebbs. He held out a hand, and Eli shook it. "Eli," he said shortly. "The girl here is Lynn. Somehow I doubt she introduced herself properly when you met." Lynn nodded to Eli across the fire. "How's Lucy?" "The girl's fine," she said. "Is that her mother screaming?" Eli nodded and gestured toward the shelter but came up with no words. Is she trying to be mother to another?" Stubbs asked gently. "All day it's been like this," Eli said. "I don't know what to do. The baby won't come out, and Neva is exhausted." A cautious silence had emanated from the shelter since they'd converged onto the camp. Lynn had stalked a bobcat through the woods once. Mother had sent her out to find a turkey, but the unfamiliar flash of a feline coat had caught her attention, and she'd taken it as a challenge. Bobcats weren't common, and Lynn had known she was out of her league when she'd emerged into a clearing where she knew the cat would have been, but it was out of sight. The same feeling was with her on the bank, the idea that she was being watched by unfriendly eyes attached to a body that was ready to pounce if it made up its mind to do so. "We're not here to bother," she said loudly, hoping her voice carried to those perked ears. "Just wanted to let you know Lucy's all right." Eli's face fell. "You're not leaving, are you?" "Hold up now," Stubbs said to Lynn. "If they need our help, we're here to give it." Lynn's eyes cut uneasily to the shelter Eli had constructed, but she kept her mouth shut. "First off, why are you down here on the stream? There's plenty of cheap houses to put her up in to bear the child." "Neva says she won't go. She's heard too many stories, people's faces turning black without water, their bodies shriveling up as they die slowly. It happens. She won't come away from the water. I set this up for a temporary camp, but she wouldn't move from it." "It's not so bad," Stubbs reassured him. Probably leaks like a bastard, though." "It's not waterproof, no," Eli admitted. "Can't hold any heat either, I reckon." In the firelight, Lynn could make out a blush creeping up Eli's sharp-boned cheeks. "No, it can't." "So here you've got a pregnant woman and a child living under a bunch of dead twigs next to a stream when winter's coming on?" "I don't know what else to do," Eli said tightly, desperation making him bite off each word. "How about not letting the most paranoid person in your bunch call the shots?" Lynn suggested, then fought her down her own blush when Eli turned his angry glare on her. Stubbs cleared his throat. "Water can be hauled. You get her set up in some real shelter with some heat in it and bring the water to her. Staying next to the stream in the summer and fall is fine, but in the spring it'll drown you, and in the summer it could disappear altogether. You stay by it in the winter, and one morning you'll wander out to your precious water source only to find out that you froze to death in the night." Eli's jawline was set tightly, and Lynn had lived long enough with the person who had a temper to know that his fuse was getting short. "I'm afraid your suggestions come a little late," he said as another wrenching moan came from the shelter behind him. "She's been fighting it." Lynn could tell by the stifled sound of the cry that the sufferer did not want them made party to her pain. Stubbs flicked on a flashlight and moved to the mouth of the shelter. "I'm here to help you. I'm no doctor, but I've seen my share of goats born and helped a few of them along." He'd made it about a foot into the shelter when he came flying backward, landing in the mud. "Keep away from me, you perverted cripple!" The scream that followed Stubbs' exit was shrill, laced with fear and pain. "Eli! Eli, where are you?" Lynn helped Stubbs up as she listened to Eli trying to calm the panicked woman inside. She approached the entrance to have a clod of dirt smacked in her face. "I'm done here," she said to Stubbs. He grabbed her arm as she turned for home. "She's in labor. You don't know what that's like." "Don't care much either," Lynn said, rubbing the spot on her jaw where the dirt had hit her. But she stayed. Eli emerged. "She said you can go in," he pointed to Lynn, "but not Stubbs." Stupid choice," Lynn said. "I don't know the first thing about this. At least he's seen it." "With goats," Eli countered. "More than I thought," Lynn answered, but ducked her head and shuffled into the shelter. The woman lay under a pile of clothes, writhing with pain. When she realized Lynn was there, she made a conscious effort to control it, but her hands dug deeply into the dirt on both sides of her hips. The repeated action had dug holes there as deep as her wrist. "You don't have to hide it," Lynn said. "Pain is nothing to be ashamed of." Black eyes regarded her with contempt. "Pain isn't the word," she seethed, her perfectly symmetric white teeth biting off each syllable. Another contraction struck, and she balled her fist into the earth. Cords stood out on her neck as she struggled against it, and her hips peeled back in a grimace. Lynn could only watch until it passed. Do something, the woman spat at her. Sweat streaked her face, even though the night was cold. Her black hair was tangled in dark coils from tossing. I can't, Lynn said calmly. I know nothing about it. Better off to let Stebbs in. He won't be touching me. The undeserved hatred directed at Stebbs made no sense to Lynn, so she sat quietly through another contraction that left Neva panting. I'm wasting my time here with you, Lynn informed her. I've got to get back. She rose to leave. Wait, I'll let him in, Neva said as if granting a favor. Just get it out of me. Lynn emerged into the darkness, handing the flashlight off to Stebbs. Your turn. He ducked into the shelter, and a murmured conversation followed, pausing whenever Neva suffered a contraction too painful to speak through. What do you think? Eli asked, his gaze bouncing off Lynn's when they met over the flickering fire. She lowered herself to the ground before answering. Don't know. She's worn out, though, and that's not good with the baby still on the way. Eli nodded, and they sat in silence. He flinched when Neva's cries came again, louder this time and more desperate. Lynn stared impassively into the fire, noticing that Stebbs had placed dead wood on it. You gotta use the dead, she said. Eli snapped out of his trance. What was that? Dead wood, she pointed to the fire. You use the green, living stuff, and you get more smoke than heat. Okay. The silence fell again, but it felt awkward now that she tried to break it unsuccessfully. Did they take your blankets, those men? Yeah, Eli's voice caught in his throat from disuse. Yeah, he repeated more clearly. Blankets and our food. I went to a house looking for more, but they'd all been stripped. Most of the clothes were gone, too, except for some that were way too big for anybody I've ever seen. I took them to use for blankets for Neva and Lucy. Stebb's voice cut through the night. Lynn, come here. She approached the entrance wearily. What is it? Take this. He handed her a bundle. Bury it. Lynn gingerly took the dirty shirt, alarmed at the heat soaking through it. She shot Stebbs a questioning glance. Born dead. He drew an arm around her shoulders, bringing her closer to him. Take the little thing a bit a ways and bury it. Mother's not doing so well. Is she going to make it? Not doing so well up here. Stebbs pointed to his temple, then his heart. And here. Lynn tucked the small bundle underneath her arm. Eli followed her downstream, dazed and silent. She had no idea how she was supposed to dig a grave in frozen ground with no shovel, but Stebbs had his hands full with the mother. She climbed to the bank when it rose to shoulder height and chose a small clearing enclosed by mountain ashes. This should be easy enough to find again, if she wants to come and see it, she said to Eli, who only nodded. His fingers were clenched tightly around the flashlight Stebbs had handed him. Plus the bank is high enough here, spring floods won't wash it away. There was no response. Lynn sat the little bundle on the ground, ignoring the wetness that had soaked through the wrappings onto her clothes. Find me a good-sized stick that's pretty sharp. Eli seemed grateful for direction. He disappeared into the darkness. Lynn waited for her eyes to adjust to the moonlight, then went back to the stream bed in search of rocks. They met again in the clearing, and he began hacking at the ground with a stick, opening raw wounds in the earth. Once he had a furrow dug, Lynn scraped away with a flat rock. We won't be able to get very deep, she said, but we'll cover him with some good-sized rocks so nothing will bother him. Him? What's that? It was a boy? Oh. Lynn thought for a second. I don't really know. Stebbs didn't say. Eli hesitated before unwinding the motionless bundle. Lynn looked away, intent on her task. You were right, he said after a moment. It was a boy. She grunted in response, unsure what to say. Eli rewrapped the tiny body. He's cold already. His hands hovered over the little bundle that had held warmth before the night had ripped it away. My brother always wanted a son. He can have more. Come help me. An hour later, Eli laid his nephew into the small hole they'd managed to scratch out, and they piled rocks on top of it. He can't, Eli said out of nowhere. Can't what? My brother, he can't have more sons. He's dead. Oh, Lynn said. Sorry. They regarded the rocks together in silence. I feel like we should say a prayer or something, Eli said after a moment. A what? Never mind, he said. I just feel like we should say something, over the grave. Lynn stood next to him in the dark, aware of the heat rolling off his body in contrast to the chill around him. I can, she said, if you want. He nodded, and Lynn took a breath of cold air before the words spilled out. I balanced all, I brought all to mind. The years to come seemed a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death. Even in the dark of night, she could feel him staring at her as she finished. That's William Butler Yeats, Eli said. How the hell do you know Yeats? I can read, and I have books, she said stiffly. When they got back to the camp, Stubbs was sitting by the fire, warming some soup he'd brought with him. She's all right, he told Eli, but you've got to get her some decent shelter. You two will die down here in a month. What do you suggest? Eli asked. She won't leave the stream, especially now. The image of the small, lonely grave in the moonlight remained unspoken. Well, it's not a bad site, really. You've got fresh water, and the bank is high enough that you should be safe from the spring thaw. It's not something you know, but the stream does go dry from time to time, so a dry summer could put you in a pinch. But there's plenty of game here once you learn to hunt, and gathering wood will be a snap now that you know how to get the right kind. Lynn wondered who was going to teach Eli to hunt. She certainly didn't have time, especially now that Lucy was her responsibility. She opened her mouth to say as much, but the sight of Eli's face, exhausted and blank, stopped her. Shelter's the priority, Stubbs continued, as of now. She won't move, and you won't make her, which means bringing the shelters to you. We can throw up something quickly in a few days, get something better and more permanent for you later, if she still won't see sense. Lynn shifted uneasily at Stubbs' use of the word we, and the encompassing wave of his arm that included her. I'm already in your debt, both of you. Eli looked intently across the fire at Lynn. Anything you do for me, there's no way for me to return the favor. You don't worry about that right now, Stubbs said, intervening easily when he saw Lynn about to open her mouth. We'll work things out as we go. So right now, keeping you and your woman alive is the priority. She's not my woman. Lynn felt an inexpressible bubble pop in her stomach. His inability should have filled her with contempt, but instead it made her want to help him. And the woman in the shelter was so sharp-tongued, it didn't take much imagination to picture him sliced to ribbons at her feet. For some reason, she didn't think she wanted to see that. Stubbs watched Eli closely for a moment before speaking. She's a good-looking woman. Yours or not. You've got a duty to protect her now. It's been my job since Bradley died. My brother. That was his baby? Yeah, his son. Neva was his wife. He died as we were leaving Entargo. One of the guards shoved Neva. Usually she's pretty light on her feet, but she was so big with the baby she lost her balance. Bradley lunged to catch her, and the guard shot him, said he was going for his gun. Just like that? Stubbs asked. Just like that. He bled out in the square with his kid and wife right there. Lucy had crawled up into my lap, bawling for someone to help her daddy, and Neva was on her hands and knees cradling his head against the baby. There was a crowd around us, and a few that I knew to be doctors, but nobody could help. Why not? Lynn's question brought Eli's attention back to her. Population schedules, he said. You're only allowed one child per couple, and they already had Lucy. Stubbs sighed and tossed a stick into the fire. I thought they would have lifted that ban by now. So that's the deal still? You screw up and your entire family is out of the city? They won't waste water on lawbreakers. Sometimes they'll keep older kids, males mostly, to help protect the city. Lucy not being a boy helped her out in that respect. Won't help her out here, Stubbs said shortly, giving Eli a hard stare. Yeah, I know, Eli said. I guess we were lucky when those men came for our food. Eva being pregnant and Lucy being, well, none of them seemed to be of that persuasion. Lynn glanced from Stubbs to Eli, completely lost. Maybe so, but your lady isn't pregnant anymore, Stubbs said. And like I said, she's your responsibility. Being good-looking doesn't seem to drop the survival rate out here. Eli darted a glance at Lynn, but she was still trying to puzzle out their earlier exchange. Being good-looking and a sharpshooter doesn't hurt, Steb said with a wry smile. The mention of shooting brought Lynn to her feet. I gotta get back. Been here long enough already. True enough, Steb said, struggling to rise. We'll get you squared away, son. There's no point in you dying here when we've got the means to help. Lynn chewed on her lip as she and Steb struck for home. His parting words to Eli had been meant to console him, but also to let her know where he stood on the issue. She'd been reluctant to offer her help for the evening, and Stebbs had promised more without asking her. She wasn't rooting for Eli and Eva to die of exposure, but she wasn't exactly against them figuring out the basics of survival on their own, either. Stebbs seemed to understand her mood and held his tongue. Early morning dew had fallen on the long grass, soaking their pants as they walked and chilling them to the bone. Lynn clicked off the flashlight to save batteries once a strip of gray appeared on the horizon. They were halfway to her house when Stebbs took a misstep, and that turned his good ankle and brought him to the ground with a crash. Lynn helped him to his feet as he tested his good leg. He winced when he put weight on it. You go on it without me if you want, he said. I know you're in a hurry to get back. To Lucy, Lynn said, snaking an arm under his. Yeah, I am. Stebbs leaned against her for support. I was going to say, the pond. Yeah, that too. She ignored the curious look he shot her as she stepped back to give him some room. Can you manage? I just need to walk it off. Lynn was already backpedaling toward her house. I'll check on you, she called over her shoulder and dove through the grass, suddenly anxious. She'd been 7 when Mother had gone on an overnight hunt, too young to help carry the large chunks of meat Mother would be bringing home. Mother had promised she would be back the next day, and she had appeared by mid-evening, dragging meat behind her. Lynn had put a brave face on and claimed everything had gone well, not wanting to admit to her rock of a mother that the nighttime hours had taught her the meaning of fear. The basement was the only home she'd ever known, but waking in the middle of the night without hearing Mother's rhythmic breathing had taken away her feeling of safety. Every dark corner held an unfamiliar noise, each soft rustling, an unidentified threat. How would Lucy, a stranger to the darkness of their underground shelter, react if she woke and found Lynn gone? Lynn cracked the basement door and held her breath for a moment in order to make out the softer sounds of Lucy's rhythmic breathing rising up from below. She was safe and sleeping. Lynn snatched her rifle and climbed to the roof to check on Stebbs. A pang of guilt struck her when she saw him fumbling across the fields, a walking stick in hand. She should have helped him back to his shelter. She lowered the rifle once Stebbs made it to the rock, rested a moment, and continued toward home, picking his way through the field of coyotes that had been reduced to skeletons. There was time for a few hours of sleep, at least. Lynn crept to her cot silently so as not to disturb Lucy, and rolled to face the wall. Nightmares were nothing new to Lynn. Her waking life was full of enough disturbing images, but she didn't think it was fair that some could sneak into her dreams as well. Mother's death plagued her every night, replayed in such detail that she could count Big Bastard's teeth as they sunk into Mother's neck. Lynn closed her eyes, fully expecting to see blood spilling onto grass, or even the lonely little mound of mud she'd left behind her at the stream. Instead, it was Eli's face, flickering in the light of his badly made fire. She studied him as she drifted off to sleep, in a way that she never would have allowed herself to in daylight. She could see what Mother had meant about the dead boy whose boot she'd taken. Even starving, Eli had a sparkle of youth about him, though he lacked the paunchy cheeks of the boy she'd shot. Lynn balanced the two faces in her mind, trying to tack down what exactly made them different. In the end, she decided Eli was just easier to look at. For the first time since her death, Lynn dreamt of a face other than Mother's. Responsibility brought Lynn out of her light nap, and she went about her morning chores. Lack of sleep combined with unfamiliar emotions had her mind at a rolling boil, occupying every corner of thought, which was a good way to get killed. Her empty buckets banged against her knees as she trudged to the pond, determined to nail down the slippery feeling so she could concentrate on reality. Guilt she'd known before, when she'd failed Mother in a simple task or taken an extra sip from the purified water. The crushing weight of her own role in Mother's death was constant, a dark cloud that followed her waking thoughts that she now knew would billow into a storm of a nightmare if she slept. Smaller shards of guilt were starting to prick away at her. The image of Stebbs resting at the boulder in the field floated across her vision, and she shook it off. Her square trade of curing her venison in exchange for her scoping out the streamer's camp had turned into a mess that had landed her with more work than she'd had before. She ended up on the sharp end of that stick, so why did she feel bad about him struggling home? And she should be angry with him for volunteering both of them to help Eli and Neva, Lynn thought bitterly as she plunged her first bucket into the frigid morning water. Stebbs seemed to think that the streamers had become their responsibility, and she wasn't sure she disagreed. Their complete inability to care for themselves would leave them dead before winter. She and Stebbs had the chance to prevent that. Lynn's stomach clenched as the first flickers of doubt swept through her. The dark, sacred confines of the barn calmed her, and she breathed in deeply. Must and moisture, spilled oil on the ghost of gasoline. Above it all, she could smell the water. Straight through the plastic tanks, her nose found the scent of survival. She knew what Mother would have done. Nothing. And there would be 2 large graves next to the small ones under the ash trees. Lynn quickly dumped her second bucket into the tank to chase that picture away. She stood motionless above the tank for so long that the ripples settled, and she regarded her own reflection in the water. Lucy woke to find her new protector sitting on the other cot with her arms crossed defensively, her gaze unfocused. The little girl stretched luxuriously, reveling in the smell of her clean hair and the feeling of the warm blankets on her back. The trapped warmth from her body lulled her back down into sleep, but not before her hands brushed against something unfamiliar. A stuffed red dog, worn from years of love, had been tucked under the blankets with her. "What's this?" Just something I got for you out of the attic," Lynn said. "It's no big deal." Lynn ran her fingers over the soft, red fur, the hard nubs of plastic that formed his little black nose and eyes. "Was he yours? What's his name?" "I just called him Dog." "Dog," Lucy repeated, pinning back his floppy ears and releasing them to fall into her face. "You're not good at naming things." "I had a real dog once," Lynn said. "He answered to Dog just fine and didn't seem to mind it." Lucy tossed the stuffed animal into the air. "What happened to him?" "That," Lynn said, snapping her hand out neatly to snatch the dog before he landed, "is not a good story." Lucy stretched her thin arms out, fingers wiggling for her gift. "Can I call him Red Dog?" "Call him whatever you want," Lynn said, letting him fall to the little girl's chest, where she grabbed him in a bear hug. "He's yours now." Lynn snuggled back under the covers, taking the newly christened Red Dog with her. 2 fingers pinched onto one ear and rubbed in an ever-slowing circle as she drifted back down to sleep. "Can I ask you something?" Lucy jerked awake. "Hmm? Am I good-looking?" The child nodded, her gold curls bobbing up and down on the pillow. "Very pretty," she mumbled. Minutes of silence filled the basement, broken only by the sound of Lucy's breathing. "Huh," Lynn said finally to herself. "Who would have guessed?"